Good morning. Loud. So thanks for coming. I always like being the guy that stands between a crowd full of hungry people and lunch. But I do appreciate you guys coming out in force to attend this session. So I want to start off really kind of talking about two different things today. So one is I want to talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing in the PAM market space with traditional PAM products kind of making the transition to cloud, specifically cloud infrastructure and SaaS applications. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some challenges that we're having customers come to us with and say, you know, this is keeping us up at night. This is helping or hurting us in terms of our adoption of digital transformation and so forth. And then finally, I'm going to talk really about what the topic is, which is this notion or this market trend, this observation that there really is a convergence starting to happen between what we traditionally classify as an IGA product and what we would traditionally classify as a PAM solution. So some of the things that we're seeing with PAM products today in their ability to manage or deal with, in particular, things like cloud infrastructure, right, is that simply lifting and shifting their static technology into a cloud platform is not a simple thing that you can do. The other thing that we're seeing is that within an elastic ephemeral cloud, workloads go up and down all the time. Identifying where those privileged identities live and for how long is something that's becoming more and more difficult for traditional products to solve. And then finally, what we're seeing is that there really is a lack of focus on SaaS products. So Salesforce.com and Office 365 and privileged access controls for those, plus non-traditional things that we've never really thought of prior to, let's say, in the last few years of being privileged, such as who has access to the corporate Twitter account. So how do you regulate that? How do you control that? And how do you make that manageable? And then the other piece of it is that a lot of the traditional PAM services are, unfortunately, not minimizing the attack footprint, the attack surface. Right. What we're doing is we're vaulting credentials. We're putting stuff in a place where everybody knows how to get access to it, and then they can go and get access to what they need to be able to do their work. But we're not eliminating those accounts from the endpoint systems. And so what you have is an issue of not doing anything to reduce the footprint, if you will. And in most cases, unfortunately, governance kind of just becomes an afterthought. The risk associated with, should this user have access? Are they using it in the appropriate manner? Is their behavior when they're using it within the policy and appropriateness of what we'd like to establish from a corporate policy perspective? Some of the other traditional challenges are a lack of visibility. And again, this goes back to what I was saying, due to the ephemeral nature, you have an application that may be running on 100 instances one day, it might be running on 1,000 instances the very next, depending on load. And what if you need to get break glass access to one of those instances in production? You know, how do you discover those, put them into the request catalog, get them, you know, into the system and so forth? There's a huge over-reliance on gateway-based technologies, or what many people call jump boxes. And the challenge there is that, again, due to the elastic scale of cloud, how do you know how many jump boxes to spin up? And how do you deal with putting a jump box gateway type architecture in place in an infrastructure that's dynamic? There's also other things, you know, there's longer times to bootstrap traditional PAM products. And the other issue that we see is that it's mostly still today infrastructure focused. Database, Unix user account, Linux user account, Windows user account, that type of stuff, service accounts, but it's infrastructure focused. It's not focused on applications. It's not focused on ERP. It's not focused on SaaS delivered, and it's most certainly not cloud native in many cases. The other area that we're seeing some issues as well too is it requires a lot of extra integration work to get anybody's PAM solution to work with anybody else's IGA solution. The field level integration that goes on there can be quite brittle, and in many cases you're very dependent on vendors that may even be competitors in other spaces to work together to help you solve your problem. And then, as I talked about earlier, most systems just have rudimentary audit capabilities reporting, but they don't do any preventative risk. So again, looking at that user behavior when they're behaving or acting with that privilege and making sure that there are controls in place that are not just preventative controls or observative controls, but also controls that allow you to remediate issues, to be able to terminate sessions if somebody is behaving egregiously with the product. Kind of talk a little bit here about all the different integration points, just to give you kind of one dimension of thinking here. When you're thinking about having to solve for PAM for, let's just say, AWS or one of the other infrastructure providers, these are all the different vectors, right, that you have to concern yourself with. You have to concern yourself with who has access to the management console itself, and what can they do, right? Do we want to tie this back into understanding of, what's my license compliance? How do I know when that N+1 node spins up that I'm not incurring additional or even substantial cost back to the organization? Workload instances themselves, who can spin them up, who can spin them down, and then access to within them themselves. There's this whole trend now with serverless, so AWS Lambda, Azure functions, and so forth. Again, behave with privileged access, right? So it's yet another dimension we have to worry about. Traditional command line infrastructure, we do that pretty well, I think, as an industry. But again, that's just one dimension. Cloud databases, where's your data sitting? Who has access to the database? Who has access within the database for privileged or sensitive information? You heard the term probably no less than 20 times on the stage this morning if you were in the keynotes. APIs, 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 APIs. System-to-system communication and mobile app to system communication over APIs is proliferating, and it is only a factor worse, if you will, when you're talking about the scale that it happens within the cloud, and again, behaving with privileged access. And then kind of consuming all of this, or circling around all of this, is DevOps, right? So orchestration, Chef and Puppet and Jenkins and those tools, right, where we build out automation to be able to handle that auto scaling of up and down workload, to be able to roll out new features, new functions very rapidly and so forth within the organization. And so ultimately, when you start to look at all these different dimensions, you got to figure out, well, what's going to be my strategy? Do I need multiple different products or multiple different solutions to be able to address this type of space? So what are customers experiencing? So we've been talking a lot with customers lately on these types of topics and these challenges. Many of my core customer base are IGA customers today, and they're telling us, hey, we're trying to do this, but it doesn't work the way we need it to. Case in point, so one of the financial services customers that I worked with, they've been on this multi-year digital transformation journey. Pretty significant journey, actually, in terms of both dollar investment and the goals they want to get out to. But what they discovered is about a year into this journey is they had absolutely no governance and no control over their DevOps processes, to the point where understanding who had access to the scripts, who could make changes to the scripts, and what those scripts were doing in terms of leveraging privileged identity to be able to perform the tasks that needed to perform within these infrastructure environments and so forth, was completely out of control for them. And it's, it continues to be a challenge. I had a manufacturing client that found some significant privilege access gaps because, again, like I said, we're starting to think more and more about the fact that non-traditional applications, not just infrastructure, are relevant in terms of privileged access, meaning that we have to be able to scope who has access to your SAP environment in production and why. We have to be able to scope in things like who can make changes in Salesforce.com. And Salesforce, their role management model is not very friendly in terms of delegation. right? You can be a role within Salesforce. And so how do you manage, the change of, if I need to temporarily elevate a privilege of an individual so that they can do administrative tasks, but I don't want them to have that access all the time, how do I handle that temporal control of that as well? And then we had a retail client recently also who had some issues with a PCI audit. If you were in the previous session, there was a lot of discussion around vendor supply chain and stuff like that. It was their vendors. Their vendors actually had access to PCI data, to card payment data. And it was an inadvertent mistake, but it was something that it actually wasn't caught until audit and had been prevalent for quite some time in their systems. And so again, putting some governance and some controls around those types of things within your organization are preventative in nature, but also can be proactive in nature in terms of the fact that with the proper controls in place, you can actually remediate these things when they happen, if they are discovered and do happen. So now we get to the point where I talk about IGA and PAM converging. And so there's drivers behind why this is, right? So one of it is that I mentioned earlier, PAM is expanding beyond traditional infrastructure into applications, enterprise applications. And when you look at how IGA has facilitated the automation and the governance of those, there's a natural convergence to say, in addition to traditional application access, the people who have the keys to be able to make significant changes to the application at an architecture level, at a systems level, at a data set level, et cetera, also need to have some reins around them, and they need to abide by that same policy and context. The other thing is that this notion of stewardship or ownership of privileged accounts, and so especially true of things like service accounts or non-human accounts, digital identities, that whether we're talking about Internet of Things, whether we're talking about things like RPAs, the bots themselves, or whether we're talking about traditional infrastructure accounts, this notion of having to assign ownership and have a proper stewardship channel so that should that person leave the organization, change roles within the organization, somebody else then takes ownership of it, and that there's control processes that go around those things to be able to ensure that we have no gap in those controls, and that there is always somebody who is on point for being the owner of that. And that's just being mandated more and more out of best practice, but also we're starting to see it in regulations as well. The other piece that we're seeing a huge thing is this whole notion of requirements for more complex workflow approval than what comes in a classic PAM solution. So I go to a PAM solution, I need to request access. Before I get that access, somebody has to approve me getting that access. Let's say, again, back in the break glass scenario. Those can be very complex sometimes. They could be time-based components to that policy. There could be multi-step approvals to those policies, and in many cases, a lot of what we're seeing out there in the market today, the PAM products themselves don't lend themselves to that as well as an IGA solution does in terms of being able to do that whole choreography, that whole workflow choreography. Then you compound that with, we don't want to have people have access all the time. It needs to be bound temporarily, right? It needs to be time-based. We need to say, hey, for this period of time, whether it's a 4-hour session or a 1-hour session or an 8-hour session, this individual can absolutely have access. But it's also about not only having that access, but can we do something to reduce the attack surface as well? Does the privileged account even need to exist in that system if it's not in use? So just-in-time provisioning also becomes something that we may want to explore as well. The need to centralize request of access for all kinds of access to one place, right? This is something that we see commonly. Administrators don't want to have to go to 3 different systems to request access to do their job. So having it all in one place through an access request system, again, lends itself very well to IGA as well. The need to centralize roles and policy and then audit all the access. And again, that's for both privileged and non-privileged. But again, a lot of the traditional PAM solutions that are out in the marketplace today don't necessarily have a good concept of centralized policy management. Most of them cannot go into an IGA solution and pull out policy they run on a proprietary policy within the context of that system and that system alone. There is an emerging need also to apply risk scores, and this goes back to what I was talking about, or analytics, if you will, to privileged use, right? So what are these users doing with this privileged access when they have it, despite the fact that we've maybe just done just-in-time provisioning and put that account out there? We need to have the ability to, in near real time, see what they're doing, apply risk to the situation. It's one thing if they have credentials and can get in, but if they're doing it from within our network, fine. But if they're trying to do it from McDonald's or Starbucks, bad, right? We want to be able to detect those things and push that into the work stream so that we can terminate those sessions or prevent those sessions from even being launched. This is a big one, and this goes into the governance piece of it, which is periodic access review. Right? And this is everything that I've just talked about kind of in a nutshell, right? So it's looking at the fact that you've got this whole notion of stewardship. Who owns these accounts? So we need to review that periodically and make sure that that's consistent and well maintained. Then we've got the notion of the fact that we need to understand who has access to these accounts, not just who owns them. In many cases, those are two different individuals. The person who has the name stewardship of the account is not necessarily and not usually the person that's using it. And then finally, and most importantly, is you need to be able to do event-driven or, again, in-the-moment-driven proofing in a break glass event. Right? Somebody says, hey, I need to get access to the system, production down. Great, go ahead, approve that, but then close that loop. Come back and put governance around that to say, on this date, this person approved this. Do you agree with this action? So that you can put that remediation note into your auditor's hands and you're able to clarify that. And then finally, I mentioned this as well too. One of the biggest challenges that we're seeing still is that most of the vendors aren't playing well together between these two domain spaces, right? So the real challenge is how do you get IGA solutions and PAM solutions to communicate better to each other? The implementations are still what I classify as brittle. We don't have good protocols. We don't have good APIs in place, if you will, between vendors, or even a standards-based approach, which would be even better. I'm a huge proponent of standards, would be to get to that point. But we do absolutely see, based on some of these things, that there is absolutely a convergence going on, which may lead to some other things, which I'll talk about here. And that is to say that, first and foremost, I do expect to see some more collaboration between traditional best-of-breed vendors in the IGA space and traditional PAM vendors. Honestly, I think what's going to emerge out of that is at least one new API, potentially based on SCIM for doing the user management piece, and another proper API that kind of unifies the policy language between these things so that we can interoperate better together. Right? I expect that you'll see in the not too distant future, if they don't already have one, IGA vendors releasing a PAM product or a PAM-like product, or vice versa, right? PAM vendors potentially getting into the IGA space. And then we're going to see a lot more PAM solutions over the next, I would say, year or two go cloud native, meaning that they're built as SaaS solutions delivered from the cloud for the cloud, focused on protecting SaaS apps, focused on protecting cloud infrastructure, focused on platform as a service and serverless and so forth. And then one of the things that everybody has got to start focusing on from a vendor perspective is reducing the attack surface. So if the account doesn't need to be present there all the time, why leave it there, right? You simply, there's no need to it. Why not make it available for the time that the administration task needs to go, and then get rid of it or get rid of the policy associated with it, such that it's not a target anymore. So real quick advertisement for tomorrow's session. My counterpart cohort, Vibhuti Sinha, will be here tomorrow delivering a masterclass talking a lot deeper in this subject, and in general talking about specifically cloud and cloud infrastructure. He's a huge expert in both AWS and Azure, and so I'd invite you to be there. I'll be there in that room as well. And with that, about 5 minutes left. I'm going to pause for questions. Who has a question? I have a mic. Don't be bashful. Somewhere. Oh, there's the mic. Anyone? Oh, down front? Oh, all right. Do Donahue here.
Oh, okay. Oh, got it. Yeah, the topic's very interesting. Another area where we might see some integration, if we're talking about privileged access to SaaS applications, wouldn't that be more in the CASB area?
So yeah, and actually I just had this conversation with a Gartner analyst on that very subject, and the answer is yes and yes maybe. There is some vaulting-like things going on in the CASB space and some of the CASB vendor space. Certainly I think the other piece of it too is going back to what I was saying about we need more and better standards as well. What we're seeing is, especially in the infrastructure side, cloud infrastructure side, we're seeing a lot of organizations move away from dealing with passwords at all and going straight to key vaulting and key management, instead of vaulting passwords and credentials, if you will. Yes, the answer in short is yes, but it's certainly not there at a production quality today. And there's also a notion of, do you want to mix your regular access traffic through a CASB as you do your privileged traffic as well too.
And as a follow-up to that, I was just pretty interested in what you said about the vaultless access or the key vaulting.
Yeah.
What's the use case for that when we're talking about human administrators?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in a key vaulting scenario, the first thing you're going to have to do in infrastructure is establish key pairs so that you can establish an SSH session, for instance, between the end user terminal emulator and the machine itself, right? So those we typically want to keep really good tabs on so that you can't hack the session, if you will. You can't steal the key, if you will. So those get put into a vault. And the vault technologies that we've looked at are cloud-based technologies like HashiCorp that make a lot of sense for that space. But it's a very common use case, and I'm seeing more and more shops move away from doing user management in their infrastructure services and more into key management in their infrastructure services. It's again, reducing that attack surface, if you will.
Do you have any examples of vaults actually being successfully attacked that have been in the news?
I'm not aware of any off the top of my head. Doesn't mean they're impervious, I'm sure, but I'm sure they claim they are. The same has always been said that what happens to the honeypot in a CyberArk environment, right? If that's where all the crown jewel passwords are, that has to be one of the primary attack surfaces of anybody who's trying to breach the organization.
Thanks.
Anybody got any questions? Yes, sir.
How soon do you think the API standardization
Oof.
That's going to be a big factor.
It is going to be a big factor, right? I think there's already, I'm aware of one vendor that's working in the SCEM world on that. But the reality is it's going to have to come from vendors, and it's going to have to come from getting an established body of work put around it, right? Right now, it's more whiteboard than anything else from the stuff that I've been talking to with the vendors that we've been partnering with. They all have different ideas, which is another problem, because if everybody does the same thing differently, that's not going to help us either, right? We have to get to a true standard on that. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay, yeah. So when you say hybrid, meaning that some of your workloads live in the cloud, some of your workloads are still on-premise in data center. And so very first thing I would say to there is you need an API gateway solution, right? You have those in place as well already, or? Okay, so if you have API gateways, then it's, it really just becomes treating the API gateway like any other privileged access app, right? You have to manage who has access to the APIs, who can change the APIs, who can invoke the APIs, and if they're very sensitive, put time bounds around them and so forth. But app-to-app communication typically still is doing password check-in, check-out through API as well in that domain space. We haven't seen that transition yet to keys, but I think it will. Yep.
How do you foresee PAM vendors catching up with the ever-changing cloud-native capabilities?
That's a good question. I know we have an approach to it that we're actually taking to market. But I think everybody's trying to solve the problem a little bit differently. We've looked at it from making the jump box scenario as ephemeral as the workload. So we use containers that spin up for every single connection that's made to a server environment or a SaaS application, and we spin that down as soon as the session's terminated. I don't know. Honestly, I've tried to look across as being part of the product management team. You're always looking at what others are doing in the industry. I've seen the approach that cyber is taking. I've seen the approach that Beyond Trust is taking. They're different than ours, and can't say one way or another better or worse. It really is going to be ascribed to your specific business need, really. Yep, we time out. We're time out. I got the hook. Go have lunch. Thank you.